Have you ever had a wide receiver in your fantasy football lineup pull a magic man? 1 minute, he's in your lineup, going off all season long. Then the fantasy playoffs come around and... What is going on, Headliner Nation? Hopefully everyone's doing well out there today. We're going to be taking a look at some wide receivers that have kind of had a tendency to disappear in the fantasy playoffs over the last couple of years. Now, we already did this same exact show, this same topic for running backs, and we did it just last week. So if you're looking for that video, be sure to check out the channel. But in case you missed that show, let me explain how we're gonna go about doing this here today. Now, I took the overall consensus top 30 wide receivers as of right now, and I did a little bit of research. I went through and I figured out how many fantasy points per game were they scoring during the fantasy regular season, which is typically weeks 1 through 14. I then went through and found out what they do in the fantasy playoffs, which for most people are weeks 15 through 17. Then really all you have to do is take the difference between the two numbers and you can find out whether their production in the playoffs increased or decreased. Now, no, I'm not going to ask you to do any math. I did it all for you. Technically, the spreadsheet did most of the work, but still. But I have to say this once again, because I think a lot of people just get in the habit of blindly following data, and that is not how you find success in fantasy football. What you really need to do is take the data that you find, really try to understand what caused that data to happen, and then apply it to this season. Is this something that we can see happening again? It happens way more times than it should. There's a player that burns you in fantasy football in the playoffs the year prior, and then you get that in your head, and you want nothing to do with that player for the next season. But sometimes a lot of things change, or it was some unforeseen circumstance that really caused those numbers to be lower in the first place. Now, before we jump into all the data here, I want to compete against you in some best ball leagues over on Underdog Fantasy. I've already done quite a few best ball drafts here this offseason, but I want to do them the entire offseason. Now, I have already placed links below in the description of this video that are links to live drafts on Underdog where I'm waiting to compete against you. Now, maybe you're sitting there going, crap, I don't have an Underdog Fantasy account. Is it too late? Absolutely not. All you need to do is head over to Underdog Fantasy or download the app. Then create a new account using the referral code Headliners. That's a very important part, by the way, and I'm going to tell you why. But after that, all you need to do is make your initial $10 deposit. By doing that, you're going to get a special pick added to your account. Plus, you're going to get a first-time deposit offer of up to $250 in bonus cash. But there's more. I'm going to give you something else for free, a 2024 fantasy football draft guide. This guide has dynasty content, it has redraft content, and it's going to be updated between now and week 1 of the NFL season. And you're going to get it absolutely free just for signing up on Underdog, making that initial deposit, and using the referral code Headliners. But all right, now let's start looking at some data, right? Let's go ahead and bring up a list of the current consensus top 30 wide receivers, and let's see what they've scored in the fantasy regular season here over the last 2 seasons. And now that we have these numbers here on the screen in front of our face, what are some of the things that stand out to us? Well, the first thing that I see is basically something we've been saying for years. The wide receiver position is super deep. On average, there are 40 to 50 wide receivers per week that have a very good chance of scoring you at least 10 fantasy points per game. Now, some of you may be saying, 10 fantasy points isn't great. Would you want 5? Not everyone in the NFL is going to score you 15 fantasy points per week. Yes, we want all of our players to overperform every single week. But if you have a player that averages over 10 fantasy points per game at their position, excluding quarterbacks, more than likely, you're ending up with a top 15 player at the end of the year. But when I say that, I mean top 15 at their position, right? Not top 15 overall. I think everyone gets that by now, but look at how many wide receivers on this list are above 10 fantasy points on average over the span of 2 regular seasons in fantasy football. There are only 4 wide receivers out of 30 that averaged under 10 fantasy points. It's Drake London. That offense was horrible in Atlanta last year. Arthur Smith did them no favors, and on top of that, the quarterback play wasn't very good. Then we got George Pickens in Pittsburgh. Yes, Arthur Smith is involved in that offense again, but just as the offensive coordinator, he's not calling all the shots for the organization. I don't expect Mike Tomlin to allow Arthur Smith to pull the crap that he did in Atlanta just last year. How about Chris Godwin? He's close, 9.7 fantasy points per game. He's just under. That's because Mike Evans is eating everything up, and if it's not going down the field to Mike Evans, it's getting checked down to Rachaad White. And then we have Terry McLaurin, right on the verge as well, right? 9.9 fantasy points per game. Another wide receiver, a big play wide receiver that has not had consistent quarterback play in multiple years. But we also have some consistency with some of these big time studs. And this is why so many wide receivers are going earlier and earlier in fantasy drafts. Guys like CeeDee Lamb hasn't been below 13.4 fantasy points per game over the last 2 years. And don't forget, this is all half PPR scoring, not full PPR scoring. If it's full PPR, the numbers are going to be even higher. We will continue to use half PPR scoring though, because we want to make sure that we appeal across the board to most league types. Some people play half, some people play full. There are still leagues out there that play standard. Yes, I know, not a lot, but still, half PPR is a good mix of all of them. But we also have guys like Tyreek Hill. He hasn't averaged less than 18.1 fantasy points per game over the fantasy regular season the last 2 years. Jamar Chase, he's over 15 fantasy points per game. We already know Justin Jefferson, he's a stud. Amon-Ra St. Brown, he's over 14.6 in both seasons. A.J. Brown, over 14.7. And the list goes on and on and on. Obviously, the numbers are going to get a little bit lower, and that's why they're ranked a little bit lower. But this entire video is about who disappears in the fantasy playoffs. So now let's bring up the numbers between weeks 15 and 17 over the last 2 years. And when we do that, the first thing that I see is there are a lot more players that are averaging single digits in the fantasy playoffs. We have Chris Olave at 9 fantasy points per game, Michael Pittman at 9.75, DK Metcalf at 9.7, Stephon Diggs, I think everyone expects this, right? 5.45 fantasy points per game. Thanks for nothing in the fantasy playoffs, Stephon Diggs. Then we go further down the list. We got Christian Kirk at 6.5. Didn't have him in the end of 2023, so he didn't really have an opportunity to boost his average, but didn't do a whole lot the end of 2022, which was a great year overall for Christian Kirk. We also see some of these guys, so they stepped up in the fantasy playoffs. Look at CeeDee Lamb right here at the top. He averaged 15.75 in the regular season, and then on average, almost 22 fantasy points in the fantasy playoffs. We see that Tyreek Hill, slight regression, 13.5. A lot of guys right here in that 13 to 15 range with Justin Jefferson, Amon-Ra, A.J. Brown once again. We see Puka Nacua going slap off in 2023, averaging 17 fantasy points per game. Devontae Adams up there in 15, and then you can really see the rest of the numbers. Another number that really stands out, if you want to go further down the list, look at Amari Cooper. In the fantasy playoffs, dude is averaging over the last 2 years 23.25 fantasy points per game. But let's throw all the math up on the screen. I know you guys want to know, okay, what is the actual difference for these players? What is their change in production or their decrease in production percentage-wise? We'll put them up on the screen here as well. And then we'll discuss the players who had the biggest increases and decreases and see what we can find out for 2024. Now, obviously, we just mentioned Amari Cooper. 111% increase is absolutely redonkulous. We got CeeDee Lamb at the top. He saw a 39% increase. How about Tyreek Hill? A 31% decrease. Some of these numbers, they may surprise you a little bit. But we're really looking for the guys that had that bigger increase or that bigger decrease, right? So let's dive in to who those top players were on each side. If you want to pause the video for a second so you can take a look at this graph, by all means, you can do that. But let's go ahead and dive in to those who had the biggest increases first. And we've already talked about the guy who's number one on the list. It's Amari Cooper, 111% increase. Now, over the last 2 years, Amari Cooper averaged 11 fantasy points per game during the regular season. But what all of a sudden led to him then averaging 23.25 fantasy points in the fantasy playoffs? Well, I think we all know that a lot of that number, those inflated numbers, have to do with the Week 16 game against Houston last season. In that game alone last year, Amari Cooper had 15 targets, 11 receptions, 265 yards receiving, and 2 touchdowns, which is the equivalent to 46 fantasy points in one game. But it's not like that's the only game that he had where he did well. He also had 18.9 fantasy points in Week 15, the week prior. It's still an increase to what we saw during the regular season. Now, even if we take away that huge blow-up game in Week 16, over the last 2 years, Amari Cooper is averaging 7 targets for 4 catches and 86 yards per game and has 3 touchdowns in 4 games played. He's done it with Deshaun Watson. He's done it with Joe Flacco. The biggest issue here is going to be how much Cleveland decides to spread the ball around in 2024. It is not just Amari Cooper there. It's David Njoku, who we saw have huge weeks in 2023. Elijah Moore really hasn't been a whole lot yet. He'll see some targets. He'll take away some of that target share. How about Cedric Tillman? A lot of people had some second-year expectations for him, but on top of all of that, they've added Jerry Jeudy into the mix as well. Am I going to sit here and buy the fact that I believe Amari Cooper is going to go absolutely nuclear every single year in the fantasy playoffs? No. But he for sure isn't going to be one of those guys that just disappears. Which will then bring us to the second guy on the list. It's Chris Godwin, who has seen a 58% increase in production over the fantasy playoffs. And I don't know what it is about late season production, but Chris Godwin is about it. Over the 6 fantasy playoff games he's played over the last 2 years, he has a total of 64 targets, 44 catches, 580 yards, and 2 touchdowns. I will take 15 fantasy points per game in the fantasy playoffs from a wide receiver for sure. Baker is back and healthy, and he really started to lean on Chris Godwin as the season went on in Tampa Bay. Plus, Godwin is going to be able to spend a lot more time in the slot this year. We know about Trey Palmer and newly drafted Jalen McMillan and their ability to play on the outside. Let's be able to keep Chris Godwin in the slot, and you know, we love our slot wide receivers around here. Now, on top of that, Tampa Bay is usually fighting for a playoff spot late in the season, and I really don't see that changing in 2024. Let's add on top of that, their defense more than likely is going to take a step back this year, which could lead to them trailing more in games late and having to throw the football more to play catch up, and we absolutely love that. Now, Chris Godwin, he is not some fantasy playoff fluke. The guy just performs better when the games mean the most. But right behind him was George Pickens at 57%. Now, obviously, Pickens didn't have a very large role in 2022, so his playoff production wasn't too far off of what his regular season production was. But then last year happened, and the dude absolutely went out and mushroom stamped his opponents and won some people their fantasy titles. Between the weeks of 15 and 17 last season, George Pickens averaged just under 19 fantasy points per game. He had 14 catches for 373 yards and 2 touchdowns. Now Deontay Johnson is no longer there. He's in Carolina. The top wide receiver competition for George Pickens right now is Van Jefferson and rookie Roman Wilson out of Michigan. My biggest concern is the obvious improvement to the offensive line and how much does Pittsburgh pound the rock on the ground. Because one thing I think we can all agree on with Pittsburgh is as the season progresses, as the winter months come, their defense steps up and they start to run the ball a little bit more. Are we going to have enough passing offense in this offense to allow George Pickens to have those big games? I think we do. Otherwise, why bring in Russell Wilson? Why bring in Justin Fields? It's going to be improved quarterback play. The best quarterback play that George Pickens has ever had. Now, I don't think we can sit here and say, though, that George Pickens is going to average 20 points a game in the fantasy playoffs. He's still going to be a little bit more boom or bust rather than consistent, but the ceiling, we haven't even seen it yet. Next up on this list, though, was CeeDee Lamb of the Dallas Cowboys. He saw a 39% increase in the fantasy playoffs, and it seems like every single year Dallas is out there playing for their playoff life in the last few weeks of the season. They're doing whatever they can to win games. And in this offense, CeeDee Lamb is option 1 and option 2. If Dallas wants to have any chance at winning ball games consistently, they need to throw the ball to CeeDee Lamb a ton. We've seen it the past couple years. He ended the 2023 season with 11 straight games of at least 9 targets or more. The dude was top 5 among all NFL wide receivers in targets, receptions, receiving yards, yards after the catch, touchdowns, slot snaps, red zone targets, and total route wins. Now, I don't care what time of year it is. We no longer have Michael Gallup in town. I have no worries about CeeDee Lamb performing majority of the fantasy season, regardless of what week it is. Which then brings us to Mike Evans, a 37% increase in the fantasy playoffs, and you do not start your career with 10 straight 1,000-yard seasons and rack up 94 touchdowns just to be some dude who disappears late in the season. Look at it this way. They are going to want to keep this 1,000-yard season stretch going in Tampa Bay. Back-to-back years now, he has hit that 1,000-yard receiving mark during the fantasy playoffs. Heck, in 2022, he probably won a ton of people their fantasy championships because in week 17 of that year, 12 targets, 10 catches, 207 yards receiving, and 3 touchdowns. Now, we know Baker is back. We've already talked about that, and we know he likes to look down the field to Mike Evans, way more than Tom Brady ever did. And no, I'm not saying that as a joke. Evans had a better year statistically with Baker Mayfield last year than any year he had with Tom Brady. This division is up for grabs. There's records to chase. End of season Evans should be a yearly occurrence. Which will then bring us to the last guy here for increases. It's Jalen Waddle of the Miami Dolphins, who sees a 31% increase in the fantasy playoffs. Now, a lot of people out there are feeling burned by Jalen Waddle and the disappointment season that he had in 2023. But the disappointment needs to be focused on the fact that he wasn't on the field enough due to his health. The guy still had 1,000 yards receiving and 4 touchdowns, and he missed 3 games during the season. On top of that, he played less than 50% of the snaps in 2 other games. So really, 5 games of production we kind of missed out on. But when the fantasy playoffs roll around, the guy has had some big games each of the last 2 seasons. The biggest thing to worry about with Jalen Waddle is the amount of weapons in this offense. We know about Tyreek Hill, Odell Beckham. They just brought in Jonnu Smith at the tight end position. The running game is definitely something that's effective in Miami. We still really need to view Jalen Waddle as more of a boom or bust type guy late in the season. He's not going to be someone who's super safe like a Mike Evans or a CeeDee Lamb. But given the fact that we've seen Tyreek Hill been banged up with some minor injuries the past couple years, Odell Beckham, he hasn't been one to stay healthy for multiple years. We could see Jalen Waddle down the stretch with a bigger role if they can't stay healthy in Miami. All right, now real quick, before we get back into the content here, I need to set a like goal on this video. I didn't do it in the intro. I wanted to be a little sneaky, put it in the middle, and find out who's really paying attention. So if this video right here can get 750 likes, I'm going to pick a random commenter from down below to give them a free Fantasy Headliners draft guide here for 2024. So now is the time. If you haven't already, hit that like button, leave a comment down below. Let's dive right back into the content. Which then brings us to the guys now who see the biggest decrease in production during the fantasy playoffs. The first guy up is no surprise to anyone who has watched almost any football the last 2 years. It's Stefon Diggs, a 66% decrease in production. Like I said, not a damn person is surprised by hearing that number right here. This dude has an average of 5.45 fantasy points per game in the fantasy playoffs over the last 2 years. And it's not like he's had just one bad year and one good year. No, they've both sucked back-to-back years. Dude has 1 game in 2 years, over 50 yards receiving in the fantasy playoffs. But now he's in Houston. Are things going to change? Honestly, I won't be surprised if it happens again. We all know that Stefon Diggs is one of those high-end divas in the NFL. Do you think that he's going to be pumped come season's end when Nico Collins and Tank Dell have been taking away volume from him for weeks, especially if Houston is as good as a lot of people think they're going to be? They're going to have a lot of late game leads. And now that they have a viable 3-down running back in Joe Mixon, we can see them running a lot more than they have in seasons past. Now, while that's good in the NFL for Houston, that's bad for fantasy football in the wide receiver position. Less throwing and more competition for targets. It's a recipe for disaster. How about Christian Kirk of the Jacksonville Jaguars? A 42% decrease in production. And now it's been 2 straight years that Christian Kirk has disappeared in the fantasy playoffs, albeit last year due to injury. Now in 2022, he had less than 25 yards receiving in 2 of the 3 fantasy playoff games. Does he just fall off late in season? I really don't think so, because at the end of 2022, Trevor Lawrence wasn't 100% healthy. We even had CJ Beathard taking snaps at the quarterback position. But not only that, and probably maybe a little bit more importantly, in week 17 of 2022, the Jacksonville Jaguars beat the Houston Texans 31-3. That was another fantasy playoff game where Jacksonville didn't even have to throw the ball very much. They got up so fast on a huge ETN touchdown run and a defensive fumble recovery for a touchdown. They just ran the ball all game long. That right there will kill an average for a wide receiver, and it's something that was really out of his hands. Now we know Calvin Ridley is gone. Zay Jones is gone. Christian Kirk should be back and healthy this year. Now, yes, they did just bring in Gabe Davis and drafted Brian Thomas Jr. out of LSU, but there is no reason to think that Kirk doesn't soak up a ton of targets out of the slot. We love those slot snaps. We've said it multiple times once again here today, and we already know he has great chemistry with Trevor Lawrence. Now, when I look at Christian Kirk heading into 2024, he's really the safety blanket in this passing offense, in my opinion. Is he going to be a guy who just disappears at the end of every year? Not if he's healthy. Which then leads us to Ja'Marr Chase, a 39% reduction in production for Ja'Marr Chase in the fantasy playoffs. This one was a little bit surprising to me. Now, obviously, last year, there was no Joe Burrow at quarterback, but Jake Browning was playing pretty good football. But most importantly, T. Higgins was the guy popping off in the fantasy playoffs just last year. One big negative for Ja'Marr Chase is he has missed 2 of the possible 6 fantasy playoff games now over the last 2 years. By missing multiple games, he's really limiting the amount of opportunities he has to go off and help you to a fantasy football championship. It sounds like Joe Burrow should be back and healthy, and now Tyler Boyd is gone. He's in Tennessee. There is really no reason for me to enter 2024 and not look at Ja'Marr Chase as maybe one of those guys that is one of these safer, high-performing guys all season long. Now, he may be a little bit more volatile than the likes of a CeeDee Lamb or a Tyreek Hill, maybe even an Amon-Ra St. Brown, still a super high ceiling, a safer floor, and if Joe Burrow can stay healthy, we're going to see a lot of ceiling games. Which then leads us to Garrett Wilson, a 37% decrease in production in the fantasy playoffs, but I still have a ton of respect for this kid. Over his 2-year career, he has had the likes of Zach Wilson, Mike White, Bad Joe Flacco, Chris Streveler, Trevor Siemian, and Tim Boyle as his quarterbacks. Yet, despite having those guys throw him the football, he has had 1,000-yard seasons in both of his first 2 years to start his career. This decrease in production is 100% tied to bad quarterback play. With Aaron Rodgers coming back, this is the year that we should see Garrett Wilson take a jump everywhere. But what about the next guy on the list, Tyreek Hill, a 31% decrease in production? Is he that bad in the fantasy playoffs? No, he's really not. This really has a lot more to do with the fact that he goes off all season long. The bar is set so high for him going into the fantasy playoffs late in the season, it's hard to go out there and get 20 points every single game. The fact that we can sit here and say that this man has a 31% decrease in production, yet over the last 2 seasons of the fantasy playoffs is still averaging over 13 fantasy points per game is absolutely crazy. That 13.5 fantasy points per game that he's averaging in the playoffs is higher than 20 of the top 30 wide receivers' production during the fantasy regular season. I'm not buying it being a risk to have Tyreek Hill late in the season at all. And then lastly, Chris Olave of the New Orleans Saints, a 22% decrease in production. Another guy that has missed multiple games over the last 2 seasons during the fantasy playoffs. But he's averaging 11.5 fantasy points per game everywhere other than the 2022 fantasy playoffs. The 2022 fantasy playoffs was with Andy Dalton. He was throwing the football a lot more to Juwan Johnson and Rashid Shaheed. They were actually getting more targets than at that time rookie wide receiver Chris Olave. That was also the year that Taysom Hill was out there and basically doing a little bit of everything each and every week. But last year, he probably brought a lot of people to the fantasy championship if you had him in your lineup, because in week 16, he had 13 targets, 9 catches, 123 yards, and a converted 2-point conversion. We know Michael Thomas is no longer there. That adds potential targets to the plate of Chris Olave. Now we just need a healthy Derek Carr, and we should be good to go. All right, so those are the top wide receivers when it comes to an increase in production and a decrease in production during the fantasy playoffs. Were there any players that we discussed here today that you were a little bit shocked to find out some of this information? If so, leave their name down below in the comment section. Remember, once we hit our like goal, I'm going to pick a random commenter from down below anyway to give a free draft guide to. So as we get out of here for the day, do me a favor, if you haven't already, hit the like button and leave a comment down below. But I'm going to go ahead and get out of here for the day. Hopefully you enjoy the rest of your day, and then most importantly, do your part to make the world a better place.